Thank you everyone for joining. Just a couple quick housekeeping notes. Feel free to put some questions in the chat box, and thanks to everyone who submitted questions ahead of time. We'll try and save our Q&A for the very end of the session, but if there's anything pressing, we can certainly address it as the time goes on. So to kick us off, I will introduce our new CEO, Kevin Zwick, and then he will pass it to our two guest speakers before we jump into some Q&A. So without further ado, Kevin.
Great, thank you, Chana. Thank you everybody for being here with us today. It's a great turnout. Obviously a topic like this, everybody really cares about. And I'm glad to see that people have taken time out of their busy day to come learn more about the topic and hear from two experts in the field. Laura Escobar, who's one of our longtime staff people who have been working on the issue throughout the Bay Area, and then my good friend, Poncho Guevara. So before I introduce Poncho, just want to tell you a little bit about myself. I recently joined United Way Bay Area in July as the CEO, and just incredibly honored to be a part of this organization that for a long time has led the way to support the social sector and the nonprofit sector and help bring in people who want to invest in one another. And the work that United Way Bay Area does is incredibly important around breaking the cycle of poverty, getting people the tools they need so that everybody has an opportunity to succeed, and then also supporting people's basic needs, particularly around food and shelter. I come to this work from the last 20 years working in affordable housing. Previous to joining United Way this summer, for the last 12 years, I was the CEO of Housing Trust Silicon Valley. And from that perspective, I really saw how important it is that everybody has an affordable place to live. If you look at things in California, we push millions of people into poverty because of our high housing costs. So if we want to break the cycle of poverty, get to those root causes of poverty, we have to address our out of control housing crisis and all of those policies that push people out of their communities. So based off of that, I'm super excited about this webinar, about our Women's United group hosting this important topic. And then again, that we have great experts here who are going to be able to talk more about the subject. So one of those is Poncho Guevara, who is the Executive Director of Sacred Heart Community Services. Poncho has spent his entire career towards advancing those who have been economically left out of our system, from providing direct services to community organizing to leading on public policy issues. I really respect Poncho's hard work and leadership on all of these issues. We've gotten to work together on pushing good measures to support affordable housing here in Santa Clara County, and am super excited to listen to him and hear his perspectives today. So I think I'm turning it over to Poncho here, and then so we can kick off the event.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, and I just want to ground us in kind of some of the lived experience of what's actually happening right now for a lot of families that are experiencing distress, not only in terms of just dealing with the housing crisis that was already bad, but the COVID pandemic has only accelerated the level of desperation and needs that are impacting so many people. But I like to describe it as putting gasoline on a fire, because what we've been experiencing in the Bay Area has some long-standing roots, not only in terms of just being a crisis that impacts everyone, but it disproportionately impacts communities of color. And so we're gonna talk a little bit about the housing crisis and some of the roots, some of the roots in systemic racism that exist in our community. And so I'm gonna do a screen share right now. Hopefully this works. All right, so But first, to just do a little primer on what the demographics look like in the Greater Bay Area, and so and what some of these trends are. And I'm going to be sharing a couple of slides. Hopefully, you'll be able to see them about the race and ethnicity in the 9-county Bay Area. And this is information that's gleaned from the Bay Area Equity Atlas. And so if you could see some of the demographic trends that have been happening since 2000, you've actually seen not only increased diversity, but you're seeing some changes that are actually happening overall in our community. And the disproportionality of the impacts of the housing crisis are only going to be exacerbated as we look forward. So that's just looking at the 9-county Bay Area, and you can see the proportions of Asian American, Latinx community members, and then the African American community staying relatively steady, but white composition actually changing over time. Those are some of the demographic trends we've seen over time. And this is Santa Clara County, where I happen to work, and I had a great opportunity to be able to work with, Kevin greatly for many years on issues around economic justice and racial justice and affordable housing here in this community. And these trends seem to be, fairly common. But you actually look at one of the trends around the percentage of African Americans in our communities actually decreased substantially. It was about 5% in 1990, down to a little over 2% today. And there are some trends around that are important to be able to recognize. But this is one of the main things I wanted to bring your attention to, is how Black and Latino residents make up 45% of very low and extremely low income houses, but only 13% of high income families. These challenges that have been long-standing are not just naturally occurring things that happen in this economy, but they're a result of a lot of things that we've done in our economy and things that we've done in terms of decisions we've made around affordable housing, in our community. So you see, for very low income housing, you see a much higher proportionality of African American and Latinx households relative to other communities, relative to their percentage of the general population, which is important to be able to be conscious of and aware of as we think about how we got into the situation. And this is also a really important one. While all families have been impacted by the housing crisis and have a significant proportion of their income that is going towards paying their rent, this percentage around rent burden, or the high cost of housing, is, when we say burden, it means you're spending more than 30% of your income on your rent or mortgage. And when you look at all households, it's around, we have nearly half of households, but especially women, over half of those that are paying rent are actually rent burdened. But that percentage, when you look at women of color, specifically Black women, are the most highly burdened, 66%, and Latino women over 62%. So you see, there are some of these trends that are there, and they have to do with some of the background or history that we've been struggling with over generations. So I'm going to switch to, and I can share these slides later on. This is all information that you can get, that you could be able to get, and there are a couple of sources for that I want to bring up for today's talk. But I want to talk about racializing land use policies, and this is something that is part of some homework that Kevin and I were supposed to be working on for a retreat happening this afternoon. It's a really good history. A lot of the work that I've been doing is in the South Bay, but I know there are folks from throughout the Bay Area. So this is a really good resource for folks to be able to look up. And it's from the Haas Institute for Fair and Inclusive Society, Roots, Race, and Place. And I want to just cover some of these trends or some of these issues that are really longstanding and tell us a lot about how we got in this situation in the first place. Well, first off, racial residential segregation in the Bay Area is not natural or simply a matter of individual preferences or actions. There is a long history dating back, hundreds of years of looking at state violence and dispossession, extrajudicial, violence that existed outside of, the normal things like mob protections and pushing people out. but also exclusionary zoning that existed in communities for a really long time, racially restricted covenants and homeowner association bylaws that existed throughout the region, throughout the Bay Area, racialized public housing that was here, and urban renewal was also a big factor in terms of pushing people out of particular neighborhoods or bulldozing low-income neighborhoods and communities. Racial steering and block busting, so realtors being able to steer people into particular neighborhoods and not into others, and municipal fragmentation and white flight. These are all conditions that existed for a very long time, and they were a big part of what made up our community. And if you look at, I'm going to jump ahead to some of these trends. If you look at this timeline of racially exclusionary policies and practices in the Bay Area, dating back to the to the 1800s, you had these elements of state violence and dispossession, like statutes that were enacted by Spanish, Mexican, and U.S. governments resulted in the dispossession of land from indigenous communities, and enforcement of these policies existed for a very long time, and continued for much of it, have continued for much of our history. And then extradition and militia violence, acts of assault and murder have existed for a long time to keep out specific racial groups. And then starting really in the 1880s, you had more formalized conditions in government where these covenants existed. Implicitly racialized zoning grew in the 1870s as well, and then they've continued for a really long time. And you had the different types of explicitly racialized zoning and other policies. So you see, there's this trend of history that's existed, that we had some already previous biases that really made it hard for communities to be more integrated and more inclusive. That and that existed as part of our of just our society in general, and the implicit bias and racism that existed in our community. But when you added on public policy, it was, again, more like the gasoline to those flames, and it only precipitated those issues. And by the time we got into urban renewal and racialized public housing policies, you only added gasoline to that fire for a long time. So it's only been in the last few decades that we've actually started to dismantle some of those things, but we didn't do any of the work to try to catch up. And so these, even though that there were policies that were passed in the 1960s in the Fair Housing Act, what we didn't necessarily do is correct some of those issues that existed before. And you've all heard the term redlining, which was certain areas of the community were allowed to be able to get loans to actually purchase homes, but only if you lived in certain neighborhoods. And this is the redlining map from the late 1930s in San Jose that includes some of these areas here that you see that are red, are a lot of the areas where for example, where my organization, Sacred Heart Community Service, operates. In one of these areas that was known as what was it, Goosetown, where it was a low-income, initially it was low-income Italian and Latinx neighborhoods that were there, and they were historically excluded. And you see certain areas that actually, if you're in one of these red zones, which were mostly populated by brown or new immigrant communities, were prevented from getting any kind of loans to be able to buy housing, and that only persisted over time. And so these types of exclusionary policies that were started back then and were reinforced both judicially and extrajudicially in terms of realtors and other folks, like preventing folks from being able to access these types of resources, only made it impossible for communities that were living in these areas to actually either upgrade their homes or be able to get other types of resources. And it was a place that was these were some of the neighborhoods that later on were oftentimes bulldozed as part of urban renewal. And so literally communities were kicked out of the neighborhoods that they had built up over generations to try to be able to make things happen, to be able to improve their communities. So these local laws that perpetuated racial exclusion were often a result of these coordinated mobilization by actors both within the public and private sectors, which really blurred the lines between public and private action. So developers, realtors, and lenders, banking institutions, and government all co-conspiring to be able to say we want to try to protect things. But you may ask, like, what does that mean for today? You know, these practices were so common. One of the things that's important to understand, these tactics were changed over time to become much more subtle. So you saw things that they weren't expressed in overtly racialized terms, but kind of low in the idea of presenting low density development patterns, consumer preferences for suburban neighborhoods and lower tax rates, and a belief that neighborhoods without apartments or low income residents or people of color would successfully maintain high property values and or appreciate the most over time. These became some of the ways that we were expressing that. And they persist to this day in very, very clear ways. So that's a little bit of, scattershot, like there's some background on some of the things that we've been dealing with, but what does it mean for today? And what are some of the changes or solutions that we want to see that could happen in our communities to try to make a difference in the situation for families? Well, one of the things that Kevin and I and other folks that have been working on affordable housing have defined like solutions to this housing crisis as really being in three major areas. And I'm kind of breaking things into four groups of things that can change or need to happen over time to help us address this particular crisis. One of the things that we need to recognize is that as a community, as communities, we're not building enough housing to be able to meet the needs of our economy. It's one of the biggest things for us to try to remember and understand. We have this economic engine in the Bay Area, and multiple ones, both in terms of, we oftentimes think of, I live in Santa Clara County and work here, and we always think of tech, but there's also manufacturing and education and other key drivers of our economy. We continue to grow in that population, but we're not building enough housing to be able to deal with those, with the influx. And one of the challenges that we have is not just thinking about how are we keeping up, but who are we keeping up for? Are we able to correct some of the challenges that we faced historically with the underinvestment in communities of color and the exclusionary tactics that we've had historically? And how are we able to try to make sure those that are here that have had a toehold and have not been pushed out yet by our policies can continue to live and think about where we want to grow and how we want to set up roots? And the three major areas of strategies that we oftentimes think about fall into are called the three Ps: protections, preservation, and production. And so these three Ps, again, protections are really about how can we protect families, especially some of those high rent burden communities of color that are in our neighborhoods right now, and a series of strategies that include strong tenant protections, such as just cause eviction ordinances, rent control policies, which exist in very few of our communities these days, anti-harassment, policies, and free and low-cost legal assistance for tenants facing eviction. These are things that have been implemented in a handful of cities across the Bay Area. And with potentially passage of Proposition 21 that's on the ballot this year, we'll be able to give local jurisdictions the ability to actually implement some of these other jurisdictions that haven't yet, returning local control to our communities to be able to make things happen. And so if you are, hopefully you're planning on voting in the elections, if you're able to, this year, there's some really important things that can be done to help us with Prop 21. There's also emergency rental assistance to prevent eviction and homelessness. And this exists in communities around the Bay Area. And we're really lucky at Sacred Heart to be leading a countywide system that's doing homelessness prevention work in our community. But that was only possible, that network was only possible because of the investment of United Way. United Way have been investing dollars, and John is going to share some more information about an amazing fund that United Way has been championing, particularly around COVID relief this year. That's really, really critical to make sure that we're not seeing further displacement by families as a result of the COVID crisis. And also another protection thing is really support for tenant organizing and the growth of tenant unions. Preservation strategies are really important. Most of the affordable housing that exists in our community is what we term as naturally affordable. And that means that they're oftentimes older housing stock that has been, oftentimes it's rent controlled. In some cases, it's not rent controlled in certain communities that are maybe not as high density as we might like to see, but it's where most working poor families live in those areas. And so raising resources to create raising resources and creating new sources of financing to preserve and build affordable homes is really, really critical. How do we preserve those that are already affordable and make it possible? We also want to increase the number of permanently affordable homes through community land trusts, limited equity cooperatives, and deed restricted housing. How can we bring some of those naturally occurring affordable housing, how can it be owned by tenants and create land trusts and other things to make sure that they're affordable for the long haul? And then preserving affordable rental housing, particularly apartments located near job centers, public transit, and services. How do we keep those together and not just make sure that they're getting replaced by new commercial development or corporate development and pushing people out the door? And the last couple areas I want to talk about are production. Oftentimes when we think about affordable housing, this is a lot of the work that Kevin and I had worked on, have been, how are we building more homes? We're creating more jobs, but are we building more homes? And so we have to make sure that we're including affordable homes within new market rate developments, including inclusionary zoning policies that make sure that we have economically diverse neighborhoods, community benefits agreements that really make sure that we're making sure that local residents are able to access those new developments that are happening, providing density bonus, increasing density, and other tools. But this is where, this is one of the things, talking about the racialized legacy of our land use policies, reducing those barriers to building affordable homes in wealthy exclusionary communities. A lot of those neighborhoods that were deemed green, green lined in communities where that investment could take place, and excluded communities of color, they needed to, that process needed to change. And so we needed to be able to, we need to look at those efforts very differently over the course of the next generation of work. And how do we stand up to neighborhood opposition to new higher density and particularly affordable housing that often uses coded language to try to say that those folks don't really belong here. We don't really need them here. We really shouldn't have that affordable, those affordable folks. And oftentimes it's coded language for, we don't want Black or brown or indigenous folks to be living in these particular neighborhoods, particularly affordable and affordable to folks that are really, really struggling the most in our housing system. And a couple other things that are really important for us to look to as well. We're expanding the renter's tax credit to return more income to low-income families, and bolstering the incomes of renters by providing quality jobs for especially targeting a lot of the low-income families, and expanding income supports and looking at reducing the cost of childcare and ensuring access to quality jobs. These things are all really, really important components. So, like, in summary, what I just want to say is, like, we got into this mess by not paying attention to the fact that just because we changed some of our policies in the 1960s around fair housing, that we that we didn't go back and try to fix and understand what was broken in the first place, and the fact that we've created the situation in a that disproportionately affects communities of color. And if we're able to work together to expand the supply of affordable housing, creating new income streams, protecting tenants, and being able to increase production in our neighborhoods throughout I keep wanting to say the valley because that's where I work, but throughout the Bay Area, it's really important for us to be able to work to do that. And our support and the support and the investment of organizations like United Way, both in terms of the work that we're doing in terms of preserving folks that have been impacted in the current crisis, but also looking at longer term policy solutions is what we need to be doing collectively. So with that, I kick it over to Laura.
Thank you, everyone. So Chana, it's time for one of our polls about how much do you think it takes to live in, we picked Alameda County, I believe. What is the cost of living for a family of 4 in Alameda County? So we'll see what the consensus is. Okay. Another minute. So it's close race. Okay, let's close. The answer is 135,000. Is that the right answer, Jenna?
No, it actually is
It's 107,000. So I was like, wait, it did. Oh, that was the highest most people said. Gotcha. It's 107,000 in Alameda County. And so United Ways have something called the real cost measure, where we look at what it takes for a family of four, different size families to live in the different counties in the Bay Area, because it does differ area to area. So thanks for that. I want to introduce myself. My name is Laura Escobar. I work at United Way, Director of Basic Needs Safety Net Services. And I've been there a very long time. And it's no coincidence I started in 1989 at United Way, because the 1980s is where we really saw the rise of homelessness. And that's no coincidence either. So kind of Poncho ended with, yes, there was fair housing and these laws were changing. But in the 70s, there were a lot of cutbacks to the federal government didn't really want to be in the affordable housing development space anymore. And so, for example, in 1979, investment in affordable housing at the federal level was 16 billion. By 1983, it was 1 billion. So you saw this steep decline in affordable housing production. So it's no coincidence that in the early 80s, and then you also had release of people from institutions, and vets coming home in the 70s and being kind of disenfranchised. You had like all of these, there was a recession, there was lots of things happening. So in the 80s, if you talk to homeless advocates, that's where you really see the uptick. So in the late 80s, United Way hired 2 young upstarts and called them a homelessness prevention specialists to try to stem this tide. What was happening? How could we keep people in their homes? So we have been at this as an agency for the better part of 30 years. So I also wanted to do a poll. I'm gonna close this. So can everyone see how many people are homeless? So I wanted you to think about how many people you think are homeless in our 8 counties of United Way Bay Area. I will tell you the answer. I went to a school and they said 1 million. I said, oh dear, that would be terrible. The answer, according to something called a point in time count, which is done by HUD every 2 years, so the last one was in January of 2019, is 32,000, which was up from 2017. And the 2 counties that saw the steepest uptick were Santa Clara and Alameda. So that's just a breakdown of the counties. So I had another poll that really looked at race and homelessness. So I wanted everyone to think about what percentage of homeless people in Alameda County are African American. Okay, so yes, you guessed right. It is 49%. But when you look at the percentage of the African American population in Alameda County, I'll come back to that, it's 11%. So the homeless population is 47%, but the actual just regular general population, it's 11. And I pulled Santa Clara too, because Poncho's here, 2.8, but the homeless population is 19. So not quite as dramatic, but still it's not representative of the general population. So people have, and if you look nationally at homeless data as a percentage of their population, Black and Latinx are the highest. So it's no coincidence with all these policies that Poncho talked about that we also see this trend in our homeless service system of care. You know, the poorest, it's the poorest of the poor and people who have, you know, struggled the most getting and keeping housing, and this jobs and housing disconnect. We have all these jobs, but we haven't been building housing to keep up. So what do we do here at United Way about all of this stuff? What my day job is mostly giving out some money that came to United Way in 1983, the United Way system for food and shelter programs. And I know many of you on this call are my food and shelter people. And so over the last 37 years, we have given out $71 million into community for food, shelter, rental assistance, utility assistance services. So that we do that year after year as a service to keep bringing these federal dollars in. This year it included some CARES dollars from the CARES Act. So we had more money to give out this year for food and shelter. United Way also founded the network that Poncho's agency is part of, the Emergency Assistance Network, that does food, that does this rental assistance. And we helped shape that network many years ago. We still support that network with resources, and they are really that safety net of Santa Clara County. You know, if you need food, someone needs rent, that's, you know, we're trying to prevent them from becoming evicted and being on the streets. We send folks to our EAN. We also, for many years, my first job at United Way as that homelessness prevention specialist was on our helpline, which eventually is now called 211, and it's where you can call. And that was part of our role, is trying to connect people who were having trouble with rent and to services that did that. And that's what I spent my first 4.5 years here doing, talking to people. And most of those calls back in 1989, early 90s, were people looking for rent or utility assistance. And one of our newer endeavors is our Spark Point centers, which help people with financial and career coaching, you know, credit, repair, all those kind of financial stability services and education. But more and more people are coming into our Spark Point centers needing basic needs, needing food. So some of our Spark Point centers have food pantries. And obviously with the COVID crisis, they're looking for rent. So we had an early investment from one of our donors to start a rent relief program sort of inside the Spark Point Center. And that's part of what we want to talk to you about today. I would also mention we also had a COVID relief fund and gave out $5 million, and a lot of it went to rental services. And now we've started and are going to be making grants for wildfire relief. So again, our long history at United Way is when there's a disaster and there's a crisis, we kind of get in gear and try to provide resources to community. So with that, I will turn it back to you. Chana, I don't know if we have another poll.
We do. Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Poncho and Kevin. I know that I have learned so much about the intersectionality of racial equity and housing affordability. And someone who really enjoys data. And so, you know, the data points are ones that stick with me a lot. The data point about the percentage of African Americans in Alameda County, the general population is 11%, but the homeless population is 47%. So before jumping into our questions, I want to do one final quick poll. So let me go ahead and get it pulled up here. And this question is about renters specifically. Laura mentioned our rental relief fund, and Amina, thanks for putting that link in the comments. So I'm going to go ahead and launch this poll. This question asks, what percentage of California renters do you think are not confident that they will be able to pay next month's rent? Give it just another minute here. So we're certainly in agreement that it's a really, really high number. I will end the polling and share the results for everyone to see. So most people actually got the answer correct. It's 54% of Californians. I mean, we live in a world right now that is just wrought with uncertainty and unpredictability. And as we see in that poll, and that's according to the Census Bureau, who put out this survey in May of 2020 this year, 54% of California renters are not confident that they'll be able to pay rent next month. Let me restate that. That means that over half of all California renters don't know if they're going to pay their rent. So, what can you do to help in this crisis? I mean, we heard from Poncho, who gave a really great background on housing affordability and how the history has led us to this current context. And Laura, thanks so much for highlighting what United Way does for our local community. So I want to just share some actions that you guys can take alongside us. So I invite every single one of these folks on this call to join United Way. And our mission is to end the cycle of poverty, and we do that through giving, advocating, and volunteering. So you've taken a really incredible first step in learning more and educating yourselves on the issues of our local community. And so we at United Way are connected to hundreds of nonprofits, just like Poncho's, to support volunteer efforts, to get really involved in the community. We have a public policy department that advocates for the policies and programs that fight the root causes of poverty on all levels of government. And lastly, what Laura Escobar was talking about with the Rental Relief Fund, this is a fund that, you know, if you're looking to just sort of help wrap a blanket of security and comfort around individuals and families that are facing rental eviction, I just invite you to consider a donation to this Rental Relief Fund. And SparkPoint locations will distribute rental assistance funds to SparkPoint clients who are facing economic hardships during COVID-19. And the last thing that I'll say about that is that the demand at these SparkPoint centers is so heartbreakingly high that some of the SparkPoint centers have had to turn away clients because we don't have enough fund in this rental relief fund. So the link is in that chat box there. And finally, I want to just say that this webinar has been made possible thanks to our very own United Way's affinity group called Women United. And Women United is a group of powerhouse women who fight to help fight poverty alleviation in the Bay Area. We do volunteer events, we do educational sessions, lunch and learns. We do a lot of really amazing work around policy, and I will be sending out a follow-up email to everyone here today with more information on Women United and with a quick survey. It's just 5 questions, and it would be really helpful if you could fill out that survey. You can talk about your interest in Women United. You can tell us some feedback from this webinar, and it'll be just about 2 minutes for that survey. So without further ado, I will open the floor up to some of our questions in the last couple minutes that were submitted ahead of time. So Poncho and Laura, go ahead and unmute yourself for this first question, which comes from Paul, who asks, what rental assistance programs are available to low-income households?
There are, well, I'll say the Bay Area. You can talk about Santa Clara. I mean, so the EAN in Santa Clara, and so Poncho can talk about that. And then there's some other efforts in Santa Clara County, but I would say in each county it looks a little different, depending on, you know, Contra Costa, it's these 3, and Solano, it's these 2. So that's why our 2-on-1 system is a good place to start trying to navigate that, because it looks different in every county. In San Mateo, you have something called the core service agencies, which are like kind of like the EAN, depending on where you live and your city. There's a kind of a safety need, basic needs agency where you can go and kind of get into the process. Poncho, do you want to add to that for Santa Clara?
Yeah, I'll just add that that there are these networks that exist around the community. One of the things that's been helpful during the recovery, during this period of COVID, has been the additional unemployment that was offered to folks that had that were eligible for that system. But a lot of undocumented families, immigrant families, refugees, and others were not eligible for those types of benefits. And so we've constructed in certain communities, I know Santa Clara at least, and San Mateo, constructed other financial relief kinds of systems to be able to make sure we're targeting them. And the financial assistance that United Way has provided is also eligible for folks that really have nowhere else they can go. And so there's a lot of work that needs to happen, not only to knit together a stronger safety net for everyone, but also work on the policy level, but also the financial assistance getting out to people is being done in a very quick and transparent way. And we're oftentimes providing direct assistance to families now versus just paying like rent, going through landlords with all the federal dollars and restrictions that are coming with it. So there's a lot of creativity happening right now, but it's happening through local organizations that are in these networks, and your dollars go to help support them to do not just the financial assistance, but do things like food and other things to help people meet their critical needs.
Thanks so much. Our next question comes from Ligia, and she asks about undocumented people and if they're more likely to be discriminated against. Poncho, can you talk about any laws surrounding folks who are undocumented?
I just mentioned a little bit about one of the elements of discrimination is actually coming from our government, saying that they can't actually access these public sources of resources, despite the fact that they're working and contributing to our community. But there are laws in many cities that are preventing discrimination based on their immigration status in terms of housing and being able to do that. But the federal government discriminates against them and getting housing relief dollars, as well from these different systems. So it's something that we collectively need to be looking at and how we're able to kind of make sure that people are getting the resources that they need on an ongoing basis.
The only exception that I know of is actually the EFSP dollars that we give out at United, through our United Way process, because I think it was founded in a time of emergency, 1983, when there was a recession. We're one of the few federal pots of money that doesn't have, it's silent on the issue, don't tell anybody, immigration. So agencies like St. Vincent de Paul, my friend I see it from St. Vincent de Paul, and some of the others can actually help immigrants with this federal resource for 1 month of rent, which we know now many people have many months of rent, but it's another piece of the puzzle. It's another bucket of money.
Yeah, and it's our job as organizations to help people get around those. So we could actually take some of these resources and use it to pay landlords directly in some cases, and absent some of the changes that have been promised by the current administration to try to prevent undocumented folks from being able to access those. We still have workarounds in some minor cases, but it does create a lot of difficulty, a lot of inefficiencies.
Right.
Well, this has been a really jam-packed session. I appreciate both of you, Poncho and Laura, and everyone on this call for listening in. There are so many questions that we got both ahead of time and in the chat box that I wish we could stick around and answer, but to be respectful of everyone's time, we'll go ahead and close it. So thank you once again, everyone on this call. I will send a follow-up email with a couple links to share with you. We hope to see you on our next webinar called Brunch and Ballots, happening October 15th. So save the date for that. Again, hosted by our Women United group. Thank you, everyone, and I hope you have a fantastic afternoon.
Thank you.